Now we'll go on to our next presentation today, which has been pre-recorded, as Father Gregory mentioned earlier. Our presenter is Dr. John Corrigan from the University of St. Thomas in Houston. He'll be presenting his paper, which is entitled From Method to Schematic, Concerning the Work of Karol Wojtyła.
Hello, and thank you, Father Gregory and the other organizers for making this conference possible. I'm going to be presenting on From Method to Schematic, and to explore the possibility that the work of Karol Wojtyła has gone far beyond what he originally intended, to suggest that what he may have started as a method for doing philosophy through a combination of several schools of thought, in fact, developed into a schematic for doing philosophy. So what he started as a method may have actually developed into a schematic, into something more, which may be developed more extensively, perhaps even into a developing group of thinkers of thought, according to Karol Wojtyła. So the question is it possible to see in the development of the thought of Karol Wojtyła a movement from the various methodological approaches to a schematic for doing philosophy? In fact, given his development of the theology of the body and his method of inquiry, which often ventured into other sciences, we may extend the question of the development of a Wojtyłan schematic of scientific inquiry to other fields. While I think this broader question is valid, I will limit myself primarily to this question as it applies to the field of philosophy. By a schematic, I mean a framework as well as a pattern of unique substantial philosophical claims, together with a way of doing philosophy which can be applied to a philosophical investigation or question. In time, this may develop into a group or even school of thinkers, though it is a bit early to say that. It seems quite certain that for Wojtyła, the emphasis of modern philosophy centers on the problem of knowledge. Referring to Wojtyła's work, Wojtyła only characterizes certain streams of modern philosophy as the philosophies of consciousness. In so doing, he notices these streams have highlighted the experience of the subjectivity of the person. This is quite a different emphasis than emphasizing abstract categories used to identify essential characteristics of a human being, as is found in the ancient and medieval philosophy of man. Categories and characteristics are useful for analyzing and understanding the ontology of a human being. However, persons as such are not the sum of categories and characteristics alone. The modern emphasis on subjectivity adds important dimensions to the philosophy of man and the philosophy of the human person. For example, the study of the affective life, a concentration of authors such as Max Scheler, yields much with regards to the subjectivity of the person in action, whereas other discoveries in relation to the processes of consciousness have yielded entirely new fields, such as in the case of psychology. Now, Wojtyła takes issue with something he labels as modern philosophy. He holds that modern philosophy, while making important discoveries and contributions, has emphasized subjectivity in a way that elevates certain aspects of consciousness at the expense of other objective truths about the person. The result has been detrimental to understanding the whole of consciousness and human experience, even to the point of a complete loss of the objective dimensions of knowledge, ethics, and metaphysics. According to his understanding of modern philosophy takes place in the analysis of consciousness. According to this, the first step is to identify the primary and secondary qualities of bodies. Bodies have extension, and this may be the only extra-mental reality which can be known about them, though temporal succession or extension through time may be another. Secondary qualities, such as color, smell, etc., do not actually inhere in the bodies themselves. These are modifications of perception in relation to the body. They cannot be known to be found in the body itself in many modern presentations. Kant then places knowledge in an even more radical state, attributing even the primary qualities to subjective a priori faculties. As such, bodies and objects are removed from the realm of knowledge altogether. They are represented by facts, which come about because of the modifying faculty of perception. The result is the subjectivizing of knowledge. Therefore, the knowledge of metaphysical essences is cast into doubt. The meaning of human action is subjectivized, as is ethics. The philosophical climate brought about by modern philosophy presents certain problems for Wojtyła. He sees modern epistemology as built on assumptions regarding the structure of the human person which are neither proved nor accurate to the human person's experience of self. These assumptions create a circularity of causality in explaining the human person. This is caused by inadequately describing the structure of the human person and human experience. This model of the human person is plagued with a subjectivist circularity incapable of adequately explaining objective human experience. The resultant epistemological idealism leads to ethical relativism, as well as the advent of various systems which seek to save or rehabilitate the devastating effects of modern epistemology, but in the end wind up in some form of subjectivism. And for Wojtyła, each of these new ethical systems presents philosophy with important contributions and insights, but none of them is sufficient, since they try to deal with the loss of objectivity in ethics from within a system which assumes an all too subjectivist philosophy of consciousness as the starting point. Wojtyła proposes a new philosophical analysis. This new philosophical analysis begins with the experience-based insights of St. John of the Cross. In John of the Cross, he believes he finds a mode of subjective experience which reveals objective realities about the person. This mode of experience is the one we have in being a human person. Such is an objective reality experienced by the subject, human person. This discovery gives renewed validity to the philosophy of being of Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. The result is an approach to objectivity which has the experience of the person, the human person, as the starting point. It is particularly in the philosophy of being, and precisely being a human person, with all the richness of the subjectivity in that experience, that Wojtyła sees an important insight missed by modern philosophy, namely that the activity of the cogito implies the objective existence of the person. He sees this insight from the very subjective experience of being a person, which is an approach different from that of the ancients and medievals and more akin to the moderns. In John of the Cross and authors like Ingarden, Stein, Hildebrand, and Reinach, Wojtyła finds academics who help him give philosophical expression to the philosophically relevant experience of being Polish and the philosophically relevant aspects of the mystical theology of John of the Cross. Now, I'm going to skip some of the historical background of Wojtyła because I assume you are well familiar with that. And I want to look at some of Wojtyła's adaptation of Aristotelian and Thomist principles. In some early articles, Wojtyła exhibits examples of Aristotelian, Aquinian, Augustinian influences on his general philosophical approach to a problem. In these, he outlines basic tenets of the philosophy of being, which form his own philosophical positions on, for example, formal and material object, an existential view of the good, natural law, the measure of being, exemplariness, the hierarchy of goods, ends, and human freedom. And again, I won't go into those in detail because I assume you're familiar with them, but these things that I'm skipping are in the longer version in the paper. Here I wish to make an important side note to Polish philosophers. The English-speaking world does not fully appreciate the role of the word problem in a Wojtyłan essay and other Polish authors. Too often this is heard as problematic and is understood as negative or as a criticism of Wojtyła or the question at hand. Largely, they are not aware of its historical roots in aporia, and even less so of its relation to the rich and diverse words for experience in Polish, which do not exist in English. If you take a few moments to explain this to an English-speaking audience in your lectures and writing, you will prevent misunderstandings and expand the grasp of Wojtyła's texts and your lectures. The same is true with, and forgive my pronunciation, Przecici. I've forgotten how to say it. Przezwycie. There simply is not a word in the English language which comes close to it. In this instance, Polish is more like ancient Latin and Greek, which are capable of packing an immense amount of meaning into one word due to the grammar of those languages. Translated lived experience, this word also carries with it the meaning found in the German words Erlebnis and Erfahrung, while carrying even more, something along the lines of endured, and actively carrying that endurance in one's person. This packed meaning in a given word or experience is quite foreign to the English-speaking world and language, which, while rich in a diversity of vocabulary, no longer carries the density of words from ancient languages. Unless one has an extensive time living with the Polish, they are likely to miss it and miss other similar multi-layer communications present in the Polish language, culture, and expression of life. We continue. In addition to having numerous Thomistic foundational principles in the makeup of his own philosophy, there is a methodological reason for the incorporation of what he calls the philosophy of being. For him, certain philosophies of consciousness do not provide an adequate basis for ethics, or even philosophy in general. This is because they can tell us nothing about real objects. This presents serious problems for ethics. So Wojtyła integrated the insights he gained from phenomenology with Aristotelian Thomistic principles. I think it would be correct to say Wojtyła holds with realist existentialists and realist phenomenologists that human experience, even without the explanation of a clear scientific analysis, makes clear that the experience of being a person and the experience of certain objective realities about being a person deliver to us real, objective content about the person and the world. The word I was trying to pronounce earlier was przeżycie, very important in Wojtyła's works. For the most part, Wojtyła adopts the Thomist position on the following areas as constitutive elements of how he understands the philosophy of being. I assume most of you are familiar with these, so in the interest of time, I'm just going to list them briefly. The formal and material objects, an existential view of the good, natural law, the measure of being, and the role of the doctrine of exemplariness in the hierarchy of goods as a means by which to critique lacunas in the philosophies of consciousness. Wojtyła sees some strengths and weaknesses in the commensuration of being and good. The strengths center on the realization of the unity of being with regards to the good of objective existence and essence. The weaknesses center on the limitations of this highly objective approach to philosophy when it comes to rendering an account for the subjectivity of the human person. When integrated correctly with his phenomenological analysis, we see some important relationships develop between the various aspects of Wojtyła's philosophy. On the one hand, he is going to bring us to consider that the philosophy of being has a place in a phenomenological investigation. On the other, there is a clear reference to teleology sitting, as it were, in the backdrop of his work because of the relationship of goods and ends. And ends, of course, being another one of those elements of Thomistic philosophy that are incorporated into him. But importantly, we need to take a small quote from his understanding of human freedom in Aquinas and the modern analysis of freedom, which he views as quite different. For the modern post-Cartesian view of the person, freedom is a postulate more than a property. And I quote, freedom as a property of the person, freedom as an attribute of the will disappears completely from the subjectivist view of the person that in various forms we encounter in modern philosophy. This is perhaps the most characteristic feature of such philosophy. Whereas according to St. Thomas Aquinas, it's treated very differently. Consciousness and self-consciousness are something derivative, a kind of fruit of the rational nature that subsists in the person, a nature crystallized in a unitary rational and free being, and not something subsistent in themselves. If consciousness and self-consciousness characterize the person, they do so only in the accidental order as derived from the rational nature on the basis of which the person acts. And this is taken from his essay Thomistic Personalism, originally published in Schematic in 1961. On the other hand, Thomas' view on freedom, according to Wojtyła, is very objectivistic. For Aquinas, the human soul is a spiritual substance with the natural properties of reason and freedom. The person's subjectivity is presented almost exclusively in an objective way. He gives us a presentation of the person in its objective existence, but it really is not possible to speak of lived experience of a person from the standpoint of Aquinas, according to Wojtyła. This role must be played by phenomenological analysis. So there's some difficulties with Wojtyła's use of Aristotelian and Aquinas philosophy. Some problems do arise as we make our way through his works. With respect to his employment of this philosophy, Wojtyła tends to use the classifications, mode, species, and order somewhat loosely and even interchangeably. At different times, he refers to the same thing as a genus or a species. I think this is legitimate depending on the starting point and aim of a given essay. It does make for some difficulty in classifying Wojtyła's work in relation to the tradition and in understanding how it relates to phenomenology and the philosophies of consciousness. However, I don't think it's a serious problem. While one could argue the accuracy of the term chosen from among, for example, genus or species, mode, they are understandable if you extend that kind of sense of understanding to what he's writing and talking about. What is important is to recognize that Wojtyła employs the philosophy of being in its phenomenological investigations, and that there is a blending of a classical ontological approach to philosophy with a phenomenological approach to philosophy which yields good results. Wojtyła combines these two approaches because of his conviction that the meaning of human experience, the common basis of all philosophical investigation, must form an organic unity and not merely a constructive unity. Quite surprisingly, for one who employs a phenomenological approach to philosophical investigation, Wojtyła often does so in the order of existential analysis followed by essential analysis. For example, this order of investigation is reflected in his investigation into consciousness, which for Wojtyła presupposes existence. There are some limits to the Aristotelian Aquinas tradition according to Wojtyła. The philosophy of being of Aristotle and Aquinas offer much to Wojtyła. On the other hand, Wojtyła claims that the experience of being a person is not well developed in Aristotle and Aquinas. This lack calls for the incorporation of phenomenology to provide what is lacking in the philosophy of being with regard to his intended investigation. This is because the tradition tends to organize the hierarchy of beings in abstract categories incapable of expressing adequately the relationship between subjectivity and objectivity in the experience of being a human person. The analysis of a subject through abstract categories is a method which produced rich results in ancient and medieval philosophy. It also lacked a proper integration of important subjective aspects of the person, such as affectivity, perception, interpretation, intuition, etc. On the other hand, the phenomenological analysis allows us to pause at the irreducibility of experience. In nearly all of his essays, Wojtyła begins with an Aristotelian Aquinas expose of those categories and classifications which are appropriate to the topic he wishes to undertake. After this analysis, he undertakes his own phenomenological analysis of the thing in question. His phenomenological analysis involves a very complex development of the meaning of experience. His phenomenological approach puts the philosophy of being in action through a reworking of the cogito argument of Descartes and the investigations of the philosophies of consciousness. Not satisfied with the claims of the majority of the proponents of the philosophies of consciousness, Wojtyła insists on running the experiment of the philosophies of consciousness again and again, from various angles, to arrive at new data, capable of rendering intelligible the apparently divergent accounts of the meaning of human experience. In general, what emerges is the conviction that the project of modern philosophy to begin in the process of consciousness does not necessarily have to arrive at an idealist or skeptic conclusion. On their own, the philosophies of consciousness have provided very rich insights into the subjectivity of the person and have supplemented some of what is missing in history. At the same time, it is possible to speak of lacunas or errors in the results of the early experiments of the philosophies of consciousness, on the basis of the new data arrived at through the experiments Wojtyła engages in. The result is a comprehensive and unified understanding of the human person in the person's objective and subjective dimensions. After this perusal of methodologies which he combines, namely what he refers to as the philosophy of being and his own phenomenological method, which draws on numerous schools of phenomenology and existentialism, we can consider how these, applied to a philosophical problem, begin to take the shape of a schematic for doing philosophy. This happens as he progresses through several philosophical problems, including, firstly, the problem of the meaning of human experience, secondly, the problem of the humanum, and thirdly, the problem of the human person considered as a category for understanding the humanum. He uses a new approach to the study of the constituting processes within consciousness. That study yields the important objective ontic structure of self-knowledge in its proper placement in relation to the cogito. If the processes of consciousness are to be understood properly in relation to the subject's experience, then our appreciation of the significance of the insight of the cogito should really begin with a new formulation. That formulation should be something along the lines of, I notice that I think, therefore I am, and not merely I think, therefore I am. This underlines the fact that understanding the process of consciousness must take place in the context of the necessary condition of the broader realm, namely the being of the subject's experience. To have the realization cogito, one must admit of an earlier objective I, having this experience cogito. So I do not exist because I think. I think because I exist. I am not a res cogitans, thinking thing. That is to say, my existence is not coextensive with my conscious thinking. Instead, I am. Thinking is a part of that personal existence. By reintroducing the objectivity of the person as a constitutive aspect of the meaning of subjective experience, Wojtyła begins the reintegration of experience and objectivity. Once the world of objects is open to an objective experience in the subject's experience, by means of the recognition of the objectivity of the one experiencing, an objective dimension becomes accessible in the subject's experience. In fact, subjectivity participates in this objective dimension by virtue of the being of the self, experiencing and cognizing. This renders demonstrable in the philosophies of consciousness the philosophy of being. It also offers a meaning of human experience which is more consistent with lived experience. The I in I think reveals a moment of self-knowledge before the completed cognitive act, I think. That I, Wojtyła identifies as the suppositum of classic philosophy. It is the autonomous subject. I know myself in experience as both the object and subject of my experience. The next section is the problem of the humanum. And I quote, the category of the person must become a key concept in the controversy over the humanum. And this appears in the problem of the constitution of culture through human praxis, originally from 1977. The comprehension of the humanum is not universal, clear, or united in its definition, understanding, or cultural implications. It is fragmented. There are many concepts of man, and therefore of the humanum. Our age is marked by the controversy over the very nature of man, the humanum. That controversy is reflected in the various opposing theories regarding the way man sees himself and his role in society. The view of the humanum affects the perception man has of himself and which man has of society. The problem of man, in this context, refers to the battle over the definition of the humanum. Per Wojtyła, we need to discover the metaphysical truths about man's nature in each successive generation, and in the midst of all the existential pessimism about man's nature, which seeks to reduce man to something less than what is contained in the reality of the human person. For example, to a highly developed material object. In other words, to just reduce man to a highly developed material object. The metaphysics of the person must be a basis for the development of a proper idea of humanum. The role of metaphysics in the proper idea of humanum implies the ontic structural relationship between moral perfection and the person. The moral perfection of the human person cannot be viewed as existing somehow extraneous or separate from the fulfillment of the person. It is an integral part of the constitution of the person. In the absence of the proper assessment and integration of the relation between the moral perfection of the person and the fulfillment of the person, we see a breakdown in idea and practice regarding the relationship between the transitive meaning of human action and the intransitive meaning of human action. To some extent, addressing the problem of humanum was contained in what I have already said about the problem of human experience, as it pertains to a better understanding of the structure of the person. For example, we saw that the humanum must be understood primarily on the basis of the suppositum, the human person, and subsequently on the basis of the subjective experience, and not the other way around. We also saw that within the experience of the process of consciousness, there is a prior experience of self-knowledge with its corollaries in moral experience and religious experience. In these, we begin to see the emergence of constitutive elements to our idea of the humanum. We recognize the subject-object nature of the suppositum, human person. We have seen that by suppositum, we are to understand person. So if the category of the person is the key to unlocking the humanum, we must ask, what does Wojtyła mean by the category of the person? Wojtyła draws our attention to the category of the person as a key concept in the controversy over the meaning of human experience. In the problem of the meaning of human experience, two historically significant traditions of the meaning of human experience seem to arrive at completely different results. The result was a divorce and discontinuity between the philosophies of the tradition, particularly the philosophy of being, and those of the modern era, particularly the philosophies of consciousness. By retracing the steps of the modern philosophies of consciousness to a moment prior to the divergence, namely the interpretation of the implications of cogito, Wojtyła was able to bring us to consider the ontic relationship between the one cognizing and the subjective processes involved in cogito. He was able to bring us to consider the ontic dependency of the subjectivity of the person on the objectivity of the person as a real ontic being. He demonstrated this through the consideration of the implied objectivity to subjective processes such as I know. There is an ontic support, the suppositum, the human person, necessary for the subjective processes of consciousness. This ontic support is not a posited abstract category, but in fact is experienced in the very act I know. This brought out the ontic objective reality of the person as the seat of the considerations regarding the cogito and other moments of consciousness. Similarly, in the controversy over the humanum, Wojtyła draws our attention to the metaphysics of the humanum contained in the category person, which we experience and can analyze phenomenologically. To say that we can analyze this phenomenologically, I mean that we ourselves have this experience, an experience which is universal, the experience of being a human person. Therefore, the category of the person is a philosophical foundation for the proper idea of the humanum. This category, person, must be considered prior to any other consideration when considering man. Since we cannot reasonably talk about the praxis of man without implying person, we are forced to realize that this category acts as the ontic source of all that man is and does. Why is this important? It is important because the category of the person gives us a universal, empirical, phenomenological basis for the consideration of the metaphysical nature of man in our study of the humanum. The category of the person is not only universal, empirical, and phenomenological, it is also capable of consideration by means of abstraction. The analysis of the subject's experience as the basis of the philosophies of consciousness and the validity of an abstract analysis of an objective reality as contained in the philosophies of being are preeminently united in the experience of being a human person. This has ramifications and applicability to most, if not all, of philosophy. This moves the work of Wojtyła from a combination of methodologies and commentary on specific issues to a schematic for doing philosophy. In conclusion, there are other components of this schematic of Wojtyłan philosophy I could not comment on, as his effect on students and listeners with regard to a certain quickening, is one example of thought, insight, and penetration of a given philosophical problem. So many of us have experienced this kind of quickening in studying him. There's also a great deal that should be said about what I call the grammar of John Paul II, and how these and other factors are also contributing to a Wojtyłan schematic for doing philosophy. However, that will have to wait till a later time. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Professor Corrigan for his talk. Even though he couldn't join us in person, it's too bad he won't be able to answer any questions today.